All right, so thank you very much for the nice introduction about me. And greetings to you wherever you are on the world. I'm happy to be on this platform today to speak on the Global Sustainable Development Agenda, why Africa matters. And here I'm seeking to start a conversation in terms of whether the narration can be changed or balanced a bit, in the sense that when you look at the literature, often it's about Africa's vulnerability and how they are going to suffer most when it comes to climate change issues. But then is it possible that we can enrich the conversation by looking at the solutions that Africa brings on board as well, so that it becomes a balanced conversation going forward? And that is what I'm seeking to convince you, and I hope I'm able to do a good job. And so in terms of outline, I will quickly look at the inspiration for the topic, and then look at sustainability and sustainable construction development, because I'll be focusing on sustainable construction. And then I will look at what I have termed the African model of sustainable construction development, and then perhaps look at whether issues of colonization and foreign influence, how they have come in. And then what I will call the African model revisited, where R&D in terms of research and development that came into Africa during the oil crisis, and perhaps show some case studies. And then whether I'll be able to convince you to change the narrative, and what will be the implication for the global community, and then in conclusion. So as Professor Rodel just mentioned, I'm from the Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology in Kumasi, Ghana. It was founded in 1952 as the premier science and technology university with overall student population of about 80,000, and currently about 14,000 postgraduate students. What's also instructive is that in the year 2023, the Times Higher Education declared or adjudged the university as tops ranking for quality education with reference to specifically SDG 4. So quickly, before I start, some acknowledgement, and I wish to particularly thank Dr. Bruno, our guest of the Institute of Linguistics and Communication Studies of RWTH Arkin University, for introducing me onto this platform. And of course, to Professor Jürgen Rodel for this opportunity today. And then I also thank the national service personnel at my department, especially Buti, Damani, Ebenezer Andor, Francis K. Fosu, for helping with the slides. And then my colleagues, Professor Ritkin, Dr. Risimpe, and then also Simon Victor Hamenu for some review comments on the slides. Okay, so by way of inspiration, I take a cue from Professor Beck's presentation, which I had the opportunity to listen to. And of course, he advised, at that time I had not listened to Professor Rodel's presentation, so he advised that it would be good I listened to that as well. And I think I'll also take this opportunity to urge you that if you have not listened to both presentations, it will be good that you listen to them, because they have very instructional information for all of us. And this, after listening to especially Professor Beck's presentation, informed my choice of the topic and reinforced by Professor Rhodes. And in summary, the understanding I'm getting is that despite all the several efforts we have made and the climate action for the past 40 or 30 years, we have not seen any significant impact. And in fact, from the presentations presented by both personalities, it shows that CO2 emission is still rising at an exponential rate. Of course, the issue of complexity and challenges were also highly mentioned, especially by Professor Berg. Also to the fact that we have to pay attention to localized action as well in bringing this forward. And I can recall Professor Rodel also talking about how scientific societies can do more in terms of collaboration and integration. Illustratively, Professor Rodel gave some data about the economics, technology, and the research part of climate action, and look at China, Europe, and America. Of course, Africa was missing here, but in all, the general takeaway from both presentations is that because for the past 40 years, we have not seen any impact despite all the efforts, there is the need for a rethinking of our direction in terms of how we are going to address sustainable development. And that is why the question comes in, does Africa matter at all in all this? So one will say, yes, Africa does matter, but it does appear in the literature that currently Africa does matter only in terms of the fact that it is vulnerable or most vulnerable to the effects of climate change. There seems to be little conversation on Africa on the scientific and technological contribution that it has done in the past and the potential going into the future. And this is where I'm trying to see whether I can convince you in terms of changing the narration. So how am I seeking to change the narration? Is it a valid question to ask? It will appear as if perhaps Africa has no architecture, if you read some of the past literature, especially looking at the work of Labelle Poussin. And then this figure on the left is from Diala Baudel, shows some impressive architecture of indigenous building of the Songhai Empire in Mali. Of course, there could have been some foreign influences, but it's a testimony of what Africa has done in the past in terms of building close to the environment in terms of sustainable construction practice. So what I'm seeking to do is, can we fall on this and help to change the narration for the way Africa has to contribute? Here you see after colonization and civilization and the interference of sustainable construction practices in Africa, even somewhere over the years in the 1970s, there was a U-turn in, for instance, Ghana and many other African countries during the oil crisis, where there was intensive research and development in the use of indigenous materials. And along the line, these were also abandoned. So I'm seeking here to project and interrogate whether this could be channeled in terms of improving the narration in Africa. And also for the fact that Africa being, so to speak, the youngest continent to the future, where the infrastructure base needed for the growth of the continent is still yet to be built. So what it means is that there's a huge opportunity for Africa going into building its infrastructure to build sustainably, instead of moving along the same line that the Western model has gone, because that will then help in increasing the climate change as we are talking about. So I pose the question, does Africa needs to be credited far more than the current discourse that focuses mainly on its vulnerability? So I will do a quick clarification here in terms of definition, sustainability and sustainable construction. But of course, if you listen to Professor Berg and Professor Ode, they have done that a lot. So I'm not going to waste my time. But just to bring in the issue of, since what we are talking about is eventually linked to population growth, of course, where African comes in a lot, perhaps we need to be reminded of the work of Thomas Malthus in terms of during the era of the Industrial Revolution, when he tried to link population to resources, although in that case, he was specifically talking about population and food production. And even though it turned out later that technology more or less didn't support his theory, it is also true that population does matters, and that is all what we are talking about with relation to the issue of environment and how it affects climate change. But then it needs to be said that one of the major platforms in terms of bringing sustainability issues is this Colonial Declaration in 1974 in Mexico, where the issue of the environment and environmental impact and how we have to take care of the environment in terms of human needs and environment was established. And it is suggested that it formed the foundation for the Brundtland Report, which has become the general definition of sustainable development that we know in the literature. And so going forward, I want to see how this now veers into sustainable construction and then begin to take my argument from there. And so if you read the work of Christina Du Plessis in the year 2005, you will realize that the attempt to have a global consensus on sustainable construction actually started somewhere in 1994, when the first international conference was held in the US, Tampa. And of course, the first definition of sustainable construction was coined by Charles Kilbert. So the question to be asked here is, if you look at the key words here, it talks about the environmental impacts and trying to establish harmony between natural and the built environment. The key question here is, as I'll be showing you later with case studies, during the oil crisis in Ghana, for instance, and then Africa, Ghana and some other African countries, Kenya, as I said, did a lot of intensive research on R&D, which was environmentally friendly. So that will mean that it took about maybe 2 decades before the first definition of sustainable construction actually emerged on the global platform, when issues in terms of positive works were going on in Africa. So the question will be whether these were ignored in the global conversation, or they were fully incorporated in terms of the narration, in terms of the positive things that Africa can offer. And that's the perspective that I'm trying to convince you about. And following the definition of the global agenda for sustainable construction, there was the issue that African countries, and especially developing countries, have not been treated in terms of equal basis when it comes to the global sustainable development agenda. And especially, it was also agreed that to be able to achieve that, then the construction industry has a key role to play. And so somewhere around the year 2000, there was the movement towards establishing Agenda 21 for sustainable construction in developing countries. And this was based on the admission that previously developing countries had not been factored into this. And this was led by the CIB, which is the global construction body that led this particular agenda. If you read the work of Du Plessis, it will become clear that the Agenda 21 for sustainable construction in developing countries anchored on 3 main areas in terms of technology enablers, institutional enablers, and then system enablers. But then there was the issue of the duality of the definitions, and how especially the West and other global frameworks or bodies came to a consensus on the definition. So for instance, Du Plessis in the year 2007 identifies a duality which is worth noting, that there was that model which suggested that the status quo should be sustained, seeking for improvement in living standards. And there it is termed the Western growth model. And then there was also the model asking for rethinking of human interaction with nature and the environment, which I chose to call the African model now, as I just demonstrated, even coming out from colonization, the way Africa construction was sustainable already, and then even after the foreign influence and interference, especially in the 1970s, African countries made a U-turn by trying to now improve on these technologies. And whether, as Du Plessis is arguing here, because of this duality, the African model perhaps has been ignored in all the conversations. And that is why in the literature, the focus is only on its vulnerability and not what it can offer in terms of the science and the technology. So this is what I call, on hindsight, perhaps we could ask the question, when it comes to the definition of sustainable development or sustainable construction development, can we say that the definition is actually global and inclusive? And then the question also have to be asked, whether has Africa been considered as equal partner in the discourse in terms of when it comes to science and technology? And I'll be seeking to use the literature to convince you in this whether it is yes or no. So when it comes to the issue of inclusiveness or not, this is based on the work of J.S. Day in the year 1993, published in Sustainable Development in the African Context, revisiting some theoretical and methodological issues. And this is what they said. For most part, views on sustainable development have not given due recognition to the fact that local peoples have culturally constructed ways of reflecting in their daily lives and the surrounding natural environment. There also goes on to say that why has it taken so long for development experts to tap the knowledge, the rich sources of local knowledges in these communities? And listening to Professor Berg the other time, one of the key issues that he mentioned was the fact that we need to begin to look at local efforts in terms of how it can help in the sustainable development agenda. And I think here you realize that there is pointing to the same fact that perhaps African knowledge in terms of what it can offer has not been really considered in the narration. In the same way, if you look at the work of Du Plessis in the year 2005, there was a call for the increasing voice of developing countries. And here, as I quote, Du Plessis said, international conversation on sustainable construction showed an almost complete absence of developing countries and its problems. And here, I will also say perhaps, and its solutions. So as Du Plessis is saying, the conversation actually ignored the contribution of developing countries and its problems. And here I will also say perhaps its solutions. And that is what I'm seeking to project in this. And so at Maastricht in the year 2000, there was a call to include developing countries in the national debate on equal basis. So what it does suggest is that over the years, there could be the perception or the reality out there that, well, I couldn't say it is either deliberate or otherwise, but Africa has been excluded in several ways when it comes to the positive aspects of what it can contribute to the sustainable development agenda, and rather focusing only on its vulnerability. And this is what Du Plessis is also supporting, as is reported in the year 2005. And the question will be whether there has been a change or it is still the status quo. One could also look at it from the perspective of market forces or local knowledge. And this is a very recent publication by Ramos, Sindela, and Mikla, the year 2020, on the Sustainable Development Goals. And this is what they state. This improvement cannot come about through adopting the Western growth model. This will only contribute to the destruction of our global environment. So here, there is some understanding that the Western growth model has, in a way, interfered with what Africa had originally. And at the time that African, through the case studies I'm going to present, even made a U-turn, this has not still been recognized in the conversation. And my argument here is that whilst it is acceptable and valid to admit that Africa is the most vulnerable and will be affected by the climate change, maybe it is time for the narration to also include the positive things in terms of solutions, looking at Africa's past and the recent past and what it can offer and the way forward. So I term this from colonization to modernity, and these narrations will all seek to project that truly, whether it is the West or it is the global community, when it comes to Africa's solution or what they can offer in terms of science and solution to the sustainable development agenda, perhaps there's an omission there. This is work done by Labelle Poussin. Labelle Poussin worked in Ghana in the 60s during the construction of the Akosombo Dam. She actually worked with the Kaiser engineers, came to Ghana, and later found herself in the public service. And in fact, worked in my center here, Center for Settlement Studies, where I worked before she went back to America. So she recently published this book, Architecture in Northern Ghana. But this is what she wrote in one paper in 1974. Until quite recently, the Western world accorded no place in its architectural scheme to Africa, with the exception of Egypt. Sorry about that. The subject of African architecture was, and indeed still is among many, not considered worthy of recognition. So this is at a time when, if you look at the figure on the right, it seems to suggest that there was some African architecture that needs to be recognized. But Labelle-Procé even still argue in her paper that during the early centuries, 19th centuries thereabout, American photographers were sent to Africa to take photographs of architecture to be able to understand the nature of the architecture and the form. And they returned home saying that there's no architecture in Africa, it is only mud and huts. And so that presupposes that or perhaps, unless we want to call it, or I will not want to call it colonial mentality, but there is that long history of not accepting that Africans really had anything to offer in the Sustainable Development Agenda program. Whilst, in fact, if you look at what the path Africa was in the past, and also the recent ones that I'll be talking about, Africa should have been given credit for the role that it had played in the past and what its technology had, and of course, in terms of improving it to science and technology for the global community to accept. This is also coming from Hannah Schreckenbach, who also in German, but is a German and worked in Ghana as an architect in the 70s. And this is an instructive statement that she also wrote in her book. The study of, so he's talking about traditional indigenous buildings here. The study of these methods will show that the traditional builder utilized to his full advantage available materials from his natural environment. And so that was the testimony to show that Africans were already focusing on the natural environment as the sustainable development goal, sustainable development agenda per the definition is now suggesting. Because if you look at the broader definition, environmental impact is actually a key in it. And on the right, you will see how influences of the European post along the coast, starting from when the Portuguese landed in the Gold Coast of Ghana. I think those who are interested can get a copy of the book and read. So I will move on to show one more example. So this is what is happening in terms of summary over there, where you will tell me from civilization to modernity. When you look on the left, you will see the map of Ghana, and it's showing buildings along the coast all the way to the top, which were built to align with the climate, and also had a lot of more or less it was eco-friendly in terms of, even though there were foreign influences, they still maintain a large element of eco-friendly materials. But if you fast forward to the year 2021, based on a recent work done by William Hunt at the University of Cambridge, when you look at the coast here and you come here, you will see that now concrete structures in Accra, in Ghana, accounts for about 84%, and the earth is only 2%. So based on the interference over the years of the Western growth model, it necessitated this change of course, I'll use Ghana as an example, but many African countries to abandon what has now been accepted as the way forward to reversing climate change and move into using materials that rather emit more CO2. And now the question will be, how are you able to convince the people to go back? And this is where I'm making the argument that perhaps the conversation cannot only be on the fact that Africans are the most vulnerable, but also on the fact that they actually had the technology and which was abandoned, and then the technology that was abandoned was actually the way forward. And there's the need for us to now all go back and see how we can improve and perfect it. So based on these narrations, I asked the question, is there the need to actually change the narrative in the sense that perhaps recognizing that Africa has also solutions to sustainable construction and, for that matter, sustainable development agenda? And then the global community acknowledging and crediting Africa for past attempts in research and development. And then also Africa, the global community acknowledging that Africa, as the youngest continent in the 21st century, perhaps holds the key to reversing the climate change using sustainable construction. So this is the argument that I'm now seeing to move forward. So the question will now be, we are looking into the past, and I've demonstrated some of them already, that Africa was already building climate friendly until the interference. And now you also now look into the future when the global community has now accepted that sustainable development is about us keeping our environment such that even though we will benefit for now, future generation will also come and benefit. So I now move on to the past, which was the oil crisis and how it affected the issue of sustainable construction in Africa. And I am sure many of you will be familiar with the oil crisis in the Gulf, as this picture is depicting, but let me move on. So this is what happened. In the West, there were fuel shortages and gas shortages all over. You can see how cars were queuing in the 70s. On the left, you will see the signage in terms of linguistics, signage, and I'm sure Dr. Bruno will have more in terms of interpretation to this, where you come in depending on which, so red will mean no gas, So this was the highlight of the oil crisis in the 1970s and how it affected the West. Of course, in the 70s, one might have said that, one would say there were not many cars in Ghana, although there were some. And one is also not clear how the fuel or gas, the gas affected Ghana to that extent. But of course, when it comes to commodity prices, that is where the impact was felt in Africa. And one of the major commodities was cement, which was the key material for construction. And it will interest you to know that right now in Ghana, the cement issue has just come back, and now there's a tug of war between cement producers and the parliament because the minister wants to institute an LI to control the prices of cement. But this is what happened in the year 1970. And so during this year in 1970, this is where, after abandoning the eco-friendly practices due to colonization, civilization, and going through modernity, and perhaps globalization, the oil crisis caused African countries to make a U-turn. And the example here I'll be showing is Ghana and the UK. So in the 1970s, on the left, this is what tech block machine that was developed in Ghana to improve on the properties of eco-friendly material for wall construction. You see here, this one was the hydroform in terms of interlocking block that was developed in Kenya later on. So at the time that countries in Africa were feeling the pinch, there was a move to now reverse and improve the technology of local materials or indigenous local materials, which were eco-friendly, And so this is where there was the U-turn. And the question to be asked is, for instance, this started in the 70s, and it was around the same time that the Cocoyoc Declaration was held in the Mexico, where sustainable development and sustainable construction were coming into mainstream global discussion. But you will realize that some African countries, including Ghana and Kenya, had perhaps even taken the lead So the question here was, were these recognized as part of the global discourse in terms of, and how did it take almost a decade or 2 decades before even the Brundtland report and also the first definition of sustainable construction, when these were actively being practiced in Africa. And I will show the next slide to show. So in Ghana, for instance, we developed a lot of training manuals that were used for the use of the construction of these materials across the country. And I'll be demonstrating some of them, as you can see. So this is a 30, on the left is a 30-seater hostel built on the university campus, made of eco-friendly material. It's just that the finishing is in cement and sandplaster, but this was built in the 1970s. On the right, the same in the 1970s. Over here, you see residential structures, and then a whole estate was acquired while these structures were used in building across the country. It was not only for block wall construction, because as sustainability is also about recycled materials, there was an attempt to also look at recycled materials. So on the left, you see shredded timber in terms of waste that was used to create what we call wood ceiling that you can see on the right. And I took a picture of this myself recently on the university campus. So what you see on the right is it's a waste material that has been turned into ceiling, which are all eco-friendly. So on the left, you see a workshop, tech block workshop built in the 1970s. And interestingly enough, about 17 or 20 years later, Francis Kerr, who is now the known author of, or the known person who is known for propagating the Kerr Foundation in terms of architecture, used a similar technique to build this in Burkina Faso, which, as I understand it, won the Aga Khan Prize and many other prizes. But what you see on the left was done in the 1970s as part of the intensive research in R&D in Ghana. And this was started, the one on the right by Francis Kerr, was in the year 1999 and completed the year 2003. So it's an understanding of how, if attention had been paid to perhaps I was speaking to this, which was done in the 70s, and then the one by Francis Kerr recently. Then I wanted to show a showcase between Ghana and the UK. On the left is what we call improved Atakpame construction, looking at the way the rural people were building. And it was also done in 1973 as an improved mud house in Ghana. And you will see that just recently in the UK, they have just adopted the first modern mud house as part of energy efficiency. So it comes back to the question that I've been asking, that with the effort done by African countries like Ghana and others in the 70s, how far were these credited and recognized into the conversation in terms of the global agenda for sustainable development? Now, this is the example from Kenya, where, as I mentioned earlier, the hydrofoam was also developed, which used the interlocking block. And then, so on the left, you can see a lot of work that was done in Kenya on local materials and how to develop it for eco construction. And then on the right, you see some houses that they have built with these materials. So these are efforts that were all done, especially in the Kenya case, which was done in the 80s and 90s, but all preceded at least the era when there was now intense conversation on sustainable development agenda and how the construction industry or the built environment can be factored into this. So here I ask the question, are alternative building technologies the solution? If the global community is accepting that alternative building technologies are the solution, then there's a case that what has been done in the past in Africa and going forward perhaps needs to be acknowledged in the conversation. Instead of just, as I admit, the vulnerability is a fact, but that needs to be also recognized. So here we are talking for a balanced conversation in terms of how this has to be done. But so when you look at the United Nations Environment Program, they do admit that traditional building practices offer sustainable solutions as African cities grow. And this is where it's linked to the fact that if you look at the population growth in Africa and in terms of the fact that the infrastructure base needed for growth is yet to start, then it means Africa has to continue on this path so that we can help in reversing climate change. And that will mean that the global community has to recognize its potential in that respect to when the conversation is going on and not only on its vulnerability. And so coming to the conclusion very soon, is Africa really ready for this? This is now a difficult question for me alone to answer. But the fact is that based on the interference over the years from the colonization, civilization, modernity, globalization, also for the fact that Africa has not been given the platform or equal platform, as Du Plessis want to put it, when it comes to these conversations. Many people in Ghana, for instance, aspire to live now in cement and mortar houses, which is obviously going to increase CO2 emission. Even local communities also show resentment to alternative building materials because they see these technologies as inferior substitutes, despite the improvement in the technology. And it's not only applicable in Ghana, as if, for instance, if you see Warrington 2013 in South Africa, similar resentments are also shown over there and might cut across Africa. So how do we convince Africa, which is the youngest continent and now to start its infrastructure boom, to begin to use alternative materials and not go the way that the Western growth model went? Is there a merit for the global community to play in changing the narrative? And I take this from the work of Susan Parnell on this paper, defining a global development agenda published in the World Development. To appear that over the years and centuries, the fact that Africa has not been considered as an equal partner runs through all the conversations. And this is what she says, that urban problems of developing countries have regained prominence in the international, even though it has regained prominence in international in the early 1970s, possibly because of the response to the major oil crisis. But it does appear that the World Bank and many other European countries turned to Africa because they saw it as a place that they could give loans for costly urban infrastructure for the poor countries without access to their own financial resources. And so some literature have pointed to the issue of market forces, as I mentioned earlier. So it will mean that if there's I don't want to use the word agenda, but if there's a kind of a framework where it is seen that, well, the global community only came to Africa as a source of providing loans and making money in terms of even directing them to build infrastructure that favored costly urban infrastructure, then it means that there's a kind of agenda even restricting Africans to rely on alternative building technologies that, as we say, have the way forward for reversing climate change. And so, as to whether the trend is still continuing, but this is what is established in the literature, that generally Africa has not been favored or considered as equal partner in this discourse. And so, if the global community has to make and accept to change the narrative, it means there is the need for Africa to be given credit for the potential that it has in the past in terms of what it could have offered before the interference, and then whilst it did a lot of R&D in the 70s that perhaps was also not credited or acknowledged, and now that there's a consensus for us to move into eco-friendly materials, how do you bring Africa on board? And that is why I'm making the argument that Africa will matter, not only because it is the vulnerable community, it is vulnerable and will be most affected by climate change, but it matters also because of the positive solutions that it can provide. So what will be the role of the scientific societies in coming here to the conclusion, especially as Professor Rodell highlighted this in his presentation? I think one of the challenges perhaps we had in Ghana, why the technology did not take up in the 70s, although you could attribute also to government support, is that initially the R&D focused more on improving on the compressive stress of the material. That is what the emphasis was. But reading to some literature relating to architecture, especially on the issue of the vitreous triangle, where the issues of soundness, attractiveness, and utility are very critical. I think going forward, if the role of scientific societies are to come in, then it means that R&D must, on equal basis, look at these three areas, so that whilst you are developing on the soundness, the issue of attractiveness and utility are also given prominence in the research. And that, I think, might be the way forward if you want to now bring especially the many Africans who now don't accept this as the way forward in terms of sustainable construction. So, in coming to the conclusion, the question will be asked, does Africa matter at all? And I would say, yes, Africa matters. But then it is not only because it is vulnerable and will be most affected by climate change. It matters because the African model now represents the global thinking of the global sustainability agenda. This is an admission perhaps the global community has to make. Also, because the global community now recognizes that Africa is recognized on an as an equal partner in the science and technology, and not because of its vulnerability. And also, Africa matters because the global community now recognizes that Africa's framework, which I've demonstrated over this presentation, that has and should have always been linked to eco-friendly materials, if not for the interference and the fact that they have not been credited, is actually the 21st century pathway for helping to reverse climate change and for then sustainable futures. And so it is on this note that I argue that Africa is vulnerable, all right, but there's the need, or it's possibly the need for the narration to be balanced in terms of recognizing its role and what it can do in terms of solutions. Thank you very much.